Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar series. My name is Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the China Center. I thank you for joining us today and for your support of the China Center in this webinar series. Your generosity makes programs like this possible. We particularly like to express our appreciation for Kai Mei and Joseph Terry's philanthropic gift for this program. Please consider supporting our mission and giving to the China Center through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. At the end of the program, we answer questions through the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. So please submit your questions there at any time. And when the presentation is done, we'll start with the questions. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact us via the chat function and somebody there will respond. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jessica Chen Weiss to present for us today. Dr. Weiss is an associate professor of government at Cornell University, a political science editor at the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog, and a non-resident senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Professor Weiss is the author of Powerful Patriots, Nationalist Protest in China's Foreign Relations, and her research appears in International Organization, China Quarterly, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Security Studies, Journal of Contemporary China, and Review of International Political Economy, as well as she's often in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Los Angeles Times, and Washington Quarterly. So I'd like to first welcome Professor Weiss to our webinar, and I will turn it over to you. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me and for all of you for being with us today. It's really my pleasure to share with you some new thoughts on my new book project, A World Safe for Autocracy and the Domestic Politics of Chinese Foreign Policy, and some thoughts about what might lie ahead for US-China relations. So an increasingly prevalent view holds that the United States and China are drawing close to what many are seeing as a new Cold War, or even if it's not a new Cold War, it has many of the similarities to the Cold War that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so in this view, the United States faces a China that is an existential challenger or revisionist to US hegemony and the existing rules-based international order, whether that's defined as the institutions, norms, principles, practices that have shaped global governance. But others have been more optimistic about China's integration into the international system, saying that, well, look, policies, decades of engagement work. There has been no war, no major war in East Asia. And can you imagine the counterfactual? Had the United States not normalized relations with China, kept China outside from the system, what might the system today have looked like? And some in this vein have even argued that the major problem has been China's free riding on the system or failure to contribute enough to issues like climate change. But in recent years, we've seen far greater variation in China's behavior across different international issue areas than the simple terms like revisionist or stakeholder implies. So in some issue areas, China has been a conservative defender of, for example, the United Nations Charter, but on the other hand, opposing other international institutions like the International Criminal Court and rejecting the standing of the International Tribunal on the law of the sea as regards China's claims in the South China Sea. And so at times it has been ironic that China appears to have been more invested in preserving existing arrangements than even the United States, hence sort of the irony of Xi Jinping defending globalization at Davos, or COVID-19 cooperation at the World Health Assembly, while the Trump administration withdrew from the WHO and attacked NATO. And in one of the most important areas of global governance, climate change, we've seen an abrupt reversal in China's behavior from obstructionism to what some have called leadership in the space of just a few years. And so this variation, I think, has been noted by some. For example, in an important article, Ian Johnston notes the differences in how China, as well as the United States, interacts with a variety of different parts of the international order, supportive of some, unsupportive of others, and partially supportive of still others. And this article, he presents a descriptive analysis of this difference, but not necessarily an explanation for this variation. And particularly, I think it's important also to note that any kind of matrix like this doesn't fully capture the evolving nature of these different issue areas, as well as the domestic contestation over China's approach to different issues. Because underneath the Chinese Communist Party's grand slogans of a Chinese dream or a shared future for mankind, there's really this issue by issue variation in China's attitude and behavior toward the international order. So explaining this variation is what I want to talk about today. So my starting premise is that the Chinese Communist Party leadership has been first and foremost interested in preserving its domestic survival with Xi Jinping at the helm. It's of course not its only ambition, but it's perhaps the most important ambition if the Chinese Communist Party wants to achieve anything else. It needs to remain in power. And in a world where most communist states around the world have collapsed, the CCP has been deathly afraid of going the way of others, whether that's through peaceful evolution or democratic contagion. And so the CCP's overarching goal is regime survival, a world safe for autocracy, as I wrote in Foreign Affairs. And survival is more than just repression, although of course the CCP relies on a very powerful coercive and repressive apparatus, but it's also about performance. It's about persuasion and co-optation, providing not only bread, but also circuses to bolster their domestic support. And so my book project identifies two characteristics, centrality and contestation, that shape the domestic politics of a given issue area. And it's variational in these two different dimensions that shapes China's interests and its investments, both domestically and internationally. So what are these two dimensions? First, centrality. Since the late 1970s, following Mao's death, the Chinese Communist Party's leadership has relied on the three central pillars: nationalism, the ability to secure the nation and territorial integrity, especially against foreign insults and humiliation. Secondly, economic growth, rapid economic growth that has lifted many out of poverty and delivered rapid improvement, particularly as measured by GDP growth. And so, for example, under Deng Xiaoping, rather than judging performance based on communist orthodoxy, it was pragmatic slogans like "to get rich is glorious" or black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. And third, stability, the ability to keep citizens safe from disease, disaster, crime, and terror. This has been a key pillar of the CCP's claim to rule, the legitimation of their claim to rule, even as they have maintained a single party rule throughout this period. And so on issues that can be linked to these central pillars like Taiwan, Hong Kong, and territorial disputes, China has been hyperactive in making demands, insisting on its preferences, even when these have led to international criticism and blowback, such as when China rejected the ruling on the South China Sea. And it's when international pressure has aimed at these central pillars, even at changing the regime itself, that this pressure has tended to be more likely to backfire, first heightening the CCP's sense of domestic insecurity, as well as rallying domestic audiences around the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. But not all issues are very central. So on less central issues like international peacekeeping and most issues before the United Nations, China has been considerably more flexible, reluctant to exercise its solo veto, and under international pressure, for example, that has shown more flexibility, such as how the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank would be governed, and for example, in announcing a debt sustainability framework in response to international criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative. So some features of highly central issues. So the more central an issue domestically, the more likely it is that the Chinese government is to, one, rely on performance rather than repression. So the Chinese government can still repress domestic opinion, as it did after the US fighter jet and after the Chinese fighter jet and a US spy plane collided in 2001. But it tends to rely on other kinds of performance to show its nationalist solidarity. So in 2001, for example, the Chinese side ultimately released the US crew, but not before mounting sort of a national mourning of the pilot that disappeared into the ocean, while at the same time repressing anti-American demonstrations, as I showed in my first book. Second, as I mentioned just a minute ago, international pressure that seems to be aimed at toppling these central pillars is more likely to backfire, provoking greater domestic resolve rather than deterring the government from taking tough action. And I'll get back to this in a minute. So in turn, the greater the domestic centrality of an issue, the more likely it is that the Chinese government is to go it alone on the international stage, regardless of existing norms, institutions, or external sanctions. And this could either give the Chinese government leverage or potentially to build an alternative coalition of states to advance Chinese views in an alternative set of institutions, or to simply, block international criticism and continue on its way. And ultimately, whether or not the domestic centrality of an issue puts China in conflict with other actors, norms, and institutions really depends on the prevailing set of norms, practices, and interests that govern that international issue. Now, I think it's important to note that these central pillars, nationalism, growth, and domestic stability, are often in tension with one another. And it's managing these domestic pressures, or you might call them contradictions, that creates a lot of risks and trade-offs for the Chinese government. And so that also means that an issue that touches on a central pillar of regime support could still lead to concessions if there's an equally powerful central incentive for cooperation. So for example, Taylor Fravel in his research showed that the Chinese Communist Party has been willing to make territorial compromises, a central issue, with neighboring states in order to shore up domestic security and control over minority populations, another, the pillar of domestic stability. And I'd look at China's changing stance on carbon emissions as another example of an international issue that has touched on two different central pillars: economic growth on the one hand and public stability on the other. So initially, for many years, the CCP viewed international efforts to limit carbon emissions as threatening domestic economic growth, and it acted as a spoiler, for example, at Copenhagen. But it wasn't until the scale of the catastrophe was revealed and galvanized outrage, widespread outrage, both amongst Chinese masses as well as the elite, that the government shifted strategies, investing in international efforts to limit carbon emissions. And so when public health and stability came to the fore, that's when the Chinese government got into high gear. As Xi Jinping explicitly noted, he said, "Our environmental problems have reached such severe levels that the strictest measures are required, lest they incite mass incidents," the Chinese way of describing the possibility of mass protest. And similarly, in international crises, the CCP has faced a trade-off in managing nationalist protests or mobilization, because on the one hand, grassroots mobilization and outcry can help show resolve and demonstrate that the Chinese government won't be pushed around. But this also comes at a certain cost to domestic stability, the risk that these get out of hand. And so this is a dilemma that I've argued in my first book that the international context has helped to adjudicate. So let's turn now to contestation. Contestation, in a nutshell, captures the idea that even though the CCP is a single party state, it's not a monolith. There is a great deal of domestic division and heterogeneity at both the mass and elite level, bureaucratic agencies, economic, institutional, as well as ideological differences that exist and seethe under the surface of this one party state. And in particular, we can't understand China's response to COVID-19 without reference to domestic divisions between the central government and local government. Because had the central government in Beijing known earlier of the extent of human-to-human transmission at the early days of the outbreak in Wuhan, I think it's likely that the Chinese government, the central government, would have acted sooner to contain the outbreak. So unfortunately for China and for the world, local government efforts to, on the eve of an important political meeting, they wanted to prevent potential panic and disruption. And so they stymied local efforts to report up the scale of the potential emergency. And by that time, it was too late. The pandemic, I think, has also revealed the trade-off in how it is that the Chinese system prioritizes these different central pillars, in particular, taking a safety first or stability first approach, even before growth. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, the Chinese government cracked down on conspiracy theories about the US origins of the virus. And only once they had the outbreak under control domestically, did the Chinese government go on sort of a PR offensive to boast about China's superior response to the pandemic, how inadequately other governments had responded, and in particular, sort of embracing fully conspiracy theories about the virus's origins, purported origins outside of China. So what then are the international implications of internal contestation and fragmentation? So first, the more contested international is domestically, the more likely I think we are to see problems with implementation and enforcement. I've given you the example of COVID-19. Now let's take the example of China's international environmental commitments, where we have local government officials often resisting central directives to shut down polluting firms, as local government officials are still interested in promoting economic development as their way to boost their chances of promotion up the party hierarchy. And you have Chinese officials and industries quite adept at gaming the system to provide sort of as if compliance with environmental regulations and incentives. And we see this also, when state leaders at the top set out a general direction, but still leave the specifics to be hashed out. You can often have concentrated domestic interests inside China dominating both the design as well as the implementation stage of the policy process. So, for example, research by Yuanyuan Ang suggests that the signature Belt and Road Initiative has largely provided kind of an encompassing slogan that has made it easy for domestic interest groups to use that national policy as a cover to pursue their own kind of particularistic interests. So putting these together, centrality and contestation don't map neatly onto one another because some highly central issues are also pretty domestically contested or fragmented, like climate change, trade, cyber governance. But other central issues are characterized by much lower degrees of heterogeneity or contestation, like Taiwan or Hong Kong. And some issues are kind of low. They're not very central, but there's not a whole lot of domestic division over them, like most issues before the United Nations. And finally, some low centrality issues are characterized by a high degree of domestic heterogeneity or contestation. But for example, with the Iran nuclear deal, Ian Johnston notes that China played an important role in that deal, helping to redesign a key reactor, but also failed to halt the export of ballistic missile technology to Iran due to the interests of a particular arms exporter. Now, I think it's interesting that we should expect significant movement and malleability among these issues as domestic actors try to manipulate the apparent centrality of a given issue. So, for example, subnational actors might link their demands to a central pillar in order to increase the likelihood that the government gives them goodies, whether that's policies or side payments. So, take the example of China's accession to the World Trade Organization. And during those negotiations, a variety of industries and ministries tried to lobby for protection, some more successfully than others. And it was the telecommunications industry, as well as its affiliated ministry, that were successful, linking their demands for trade protection to the national interest, framing this as about, particularly the internet, as a vector for potential dissidents to undermine the party, tapping into deep worries about the loss of Chinese sovereignty to foreign powers, as Margaret Pearson writes in her research. And it was widespread fear of this social unrest that made these arguments especially potent. In addition, the government may also try to reframe an issue to dampen domestic dissent and to increase its centrality to demonstrate resolve in international disputes. So, for example, during the U.S.-China trade war, the Chinese government framed both the trade war as well as protests in Hong Kong as part of a national struggle against foreign efforts to divide and weaken China, reminiscent of the Opium War, and using this kind of nationalist framing in order to build public support for sustaining the struggle and to bear the costs of conflict. So as survey experiments by Weiss and Zhubo Liang note, the Chinese government has effectively used its propaganda powers to frame these issues as part of an existential struggle for the Chinese nation's development. And when framed in this way, Chinese survey respondents were much more supportive of the government's handling of the trade war than when its economic costs were mentioned. Now, I want to talk about the issues in the upper left quadrant, these high centrality, low contestation issues, which are typically associated with what the Chinese government calls its core interests, issues that are central to the CCP's nationalist credentials. So the landscape of nationalism in China, or what issues appear highly central in this nationalist framework, really is affected by the Chinese government's history textbooks, patriotic propaganda, and the media. Now, the Chinese government's not the only actor involved in this kind of what you might call nationalist myth-making, but it does steer the bounds of what's domestically possible to discuss in order to align with its domestic and international objectives. So a key question is, if nationalism is malleable or endogenous to the government's domestic and foreign policy strategy, how can it have an effect, a constraining effect in particular, on decision-making? So here, in my view, nationalism defines which issues are central and which are peripheral, thereby shaping the domestic costs the government faces as it navigates a real or hypothetical foreign policy crisis or challenge. Because mobilized nationalism, whether that's online or in the streets, that increases the costs of conciliation and alters the domestic decision-making environment, because weak performance on issues that appear to be central to the defense of the nation's interests could ultimately hollow out or undermine the CCP's claim to rule. And so in this way, nationalism shapes the government's calculus, but doesn't actually tie its hands. And popular nationalism will also often provide the spark for international confrontation as Chinese netizens go global in their efforts to defend China, whether that was in the controversy over the NBA or ongoing efforts, over the last 24 hours to target Western brands like H&M or Nike for taking a stance on Xinjiang. So what does this nationalism look like in China? Surveys that I've done and others show that Chinese attitudes are generally hawkish. The majority of respondents endorse greater reliance on military strength, support greater spending on national defense, and even approve of sending Chinese troops to reclaim disputed islands in the East and South China Sea, and viewing the US military presence in the region as threatening. And so these hawkish sentiments may still affect the Chinese government's calculus, even if popular sentiments are not an independent driver of Chinese foreign policy. The more that an issue resonates with national sensitivities, the more likely foreign threats and reactions are to galvanize domestic pressure on Beijing to take a tough response. Yet, China has largely avoided the use of military force since 1979, so there must be other tactics the government has been using to manage these public opinion costs. And sometimes these tactics are symbolic, what my colleague Alan Defoe and I have called bluster, tough but ultimately vague talk that helps assuage these nationalist demands for a tough stance, but also prioritizing the economic as well as strategic interests in avoiding outright military conflict. So for example, when tensions with Japan over the East China Sea escalated in 2013, the Chinese side sort of demanded that foreign aircraft identify themselves, comply with Chinese instructions by announcing an air defense identification zone, but not actually using force to enforce that. And yet still, I think there are limits to how much the government can mitigate these domestic costs. So my colleague Alan Defoe and I, we surveyed Chinese internet users before, during, and after the United States military restarted freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea, trying to pick up the effect of these kind of resumed maneuvers on public attitudes in China. And in the days following the patrols, we found an increase in public disapproval of the Chinese government, which didn't ultimately use force to intercede or harass the US patrols. And so these results suggest that even though the Chinese government chose to exercise restraint in the moment, it did so at some domestic cost. And so the upshot of this is that for US deterrence efforts to succeed, The Chinese government has to be willing to absorb these public opinion costs, however small, for not taking action in the face of what they call US provocations. And so US policy, accordingly, I think needs to carefully calibrate in order to avoid provoking more than they end up deterring Chinese behavior. So to sum up, what does this all add up to for our understanding of Chinese foreign policy? The top line result is that the Chinese government has behaved strategically. It's invested in reshaping or rejecting international arrangements in areas that are central to their domestic rule at home, while being more willing to show flexibility or even free ride on international practices that are considered more peripheral. So if China is simultaneously a revisionist, a reformer, a free rider, and a defender of different aspects of the status quo, perhaps a better term, if we have to use one, might be disgruntled stakeholder. And so some have looked at China's growing international influence and more assertive efforts to secure China's so-called core interests and concluded that China poses an existential challenge to liberal democracy and the rules-based order. And in my view, this is an exaggeration. As I wrote in Foreign Affairs, the CCP's regime security requires a world that is safe for autocracy, one that's secure from the threat of democratic diffusion, as well as foreign efforts to subvert the CCP's rule through peaceful evolution. But this is largely a nationalist vision, not a universalizing ideology for now. And so in principle, this is also, I think, compatible with a world that's safe for democracy. Yes, the CCP is holding up its example as proof that countries can develop without democratizing. But so far, at least, Beijing is not bent on remaking other countries in its own image. Yes, Chinese companies are selling high-tech surveillance technology around the world to whomever wants to buy it. But Beijing is also not starting coups, arming communist guerrillas, or invading and installing communist regimes around the world. And so what I argue is that the CCP has sought survival and legitimacy, a legitimacy that's premised domestically on three kinds of performance: nationalism, welfare, and stability. And much of China's international behavior can be seen as the spillover effects of China's domestic investments. Sometimes these spillover effects are positive, such as China's investments in renewables or mass production of personal protective equipment. But at other times, China's domestic investments have had very negative externalities, such as their export, their sort of surveillance technology, or their demands that the NBA or other companies engage in self-censorship to operate in the Chinese market. Ultimately, taking seriously the heterogeneity or contestation underneath the surface of Chinese ideas and interests means recognizing that any description of what China wants involves a constantly moving target. So as criticism of this Chinese Communist Party and hopes for regime change have grown abroad with the spread of COVID-19, so has the CCP's willingness to show off its resolve and to proclaim a superior system. And so an open question is whether the CCP, newly frightened but also emboldened by the coronavirus and their relative response, will the CCP try to more actively tip the scales in other countries against democracy and toward autocracy? Now, to date, China's behavior has been largely pragmatic or even agnostic about the regime type of the host country that it's been involved with. The strings attached to Chinese assistance have been to the one China principle or policy, rather than how autocratic or democratic the other government is. And similarly, China's economic coercion, whether it's consumer boycotts or official sanctions, have largely been targeted at companies and governments and individuals now that have supported causes that the CCP deems threatening to its core interests, whether that's Hong Kong, Tibet, or Xinjiang. But there's also some spillover. So this could change, and it may be changing as we speak. But even if the CCP kind of ultimately embraces a more kind of universalizing mission, I think it will still be hamstrung by realpolitik. So for example, China's relationship with Vietnam, as well as their very contentious territorial dispute, has not been particularly eased by the fact that both are nominally communist. Turning then now to US policy, what are the implications of this framework? What kinds of international pressure are likely to succeed and what kinds are likely to fail or backfire? So first, if an issue is highly central but not very contested domestically, I think shifting Chinese behavior on these issues is going to be very difficult. It will require a countervailing and equally powerful central incentive for cooperation, which has become, I think, much more difficult as China has become less asymmetrically dependent on access to foreign markets and investment. And indeed, the more that international pressure aims at these issues, the more incentive China has to develop this kind of dual circulation mode of sort of resilient production, one that's not dependent on crucial foreign inputs. And I think on these central issues, foreign governments and actors have to be especially aware of the possibility of international pressure being counterproductive. So if you take Hong Kong, for example, where international criticism and condemnation has been no match so far for the CCP's fear of democratic contagion and what they see as a separatist threat to national sovereignty. And if anything, I think the CCP has invoked foreign influence to justify its increasingly repressive policies, including the national security law for Hong Kong. But even central issues, I think, can be managed to keep tensions short of conflict, such as Taiwan and the East and South China Seas. And my research has suggested the importance, particularly of symbolic performance in the form of Chinese propaganda as well as rhetoric for creating the kind of short-term flexibility that gives the CCP space not to resort to military force. Now, issues that are divided or contested domestically are ones that create opportunities for foreign governments to try to play one strong constituency off another. And so I think this worked, for example, on currency appreciation, where US-led multilateral pressure under the Obama administration and prior to that, the Bush administration, I think helped accelerate renminbi appreciation, even if the Chinese government had to ultimately compensate some of these domestic losers, if you will, of that appreciation with subsidies and other preferential policies. And so such a strategy is not about getting China to do something that's not in China's interest, but about getting China to do something that's in the interest of some powerful domestic constituencies while minimizing the opposition of others. Now, whether that kind of a strategy is feasible ultimately, I think, depends on the relative balance of power among competing domestic interests. So on currency appreciation, there were powerful actors on both sides. But in other areas, one domestic actor may have an outsized stake in the outcome and thereby capture or dominate the policy process. So for example, the Chinese military's interest in continuing to use landmine technology ultimately drove the Chinese government's refusal to sign the Ottawa Treaty despite international pressure. And on internet governance, as Molly Roberts shows in her research, censorship acts like a kind of regressive tax where elites have the means to jump the Great Firewall and many less wealthy or less educated citizens don't. And many, even up to half of the internet population, doesn't even know that the Great Firewall exists. So in such a case where the powerful aren't suffering and the less powerful have little ability to mobilize to demand changes, I don't think you should see such a strategy working very effectively. Ultimately, I think international pressure is more likely to be effective on low centrality issues. So, for example, on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or debt, you're more likely to have success mobilizing international pressure to persuade China to go along with an external consensus. So taking stock, what does this mean for the future of the international order and US-China relations? I expect most friction, as we're seeing right now, on issues that the Chinese government deems of core interest, like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, and to a lesser extent, the South China Sea. But ultimately, China's domestic social purpose, if you will, doesn't require the wholesale destruction of the existing international order, even if it does favor a much more conservative version, one that emphasizes Westphalian norms of sovereignty and non-interference. So within the United Nations, for example, China has worked quite hard to alter international norms on human rights to emphasize the primacy of state sovereignty and oversight of civil society and economic development over universal, so-called universal values of political rights and individual liberties. But still, even juxtaposed with China's emphasis on non-intervention, we still see instances where, for example, the intimidation of overseas Chinese, the extraterritorial clause in the national security law, all these actions, threaten the principle of non-interference. So if China wants to defend a return to a more Westphalian system, kind of a mutual coexistence among sovereign states, it will need to curtail these extrusions of what you might call sharp power into other states and societies. Ultimately, I think the more that the CCP leans on chauvinistic nationalism, the less successful it will be in its efforts to claim global leadership and attract international support. Around the world, Chinese efforts to both, proclaim superiority in combating the coronavirus have fueled suspicion and alarm, as well as demands, for reparations and calls for rethinking ties with China. And most recently, their actions, in Xinjiang and Hong Kong have elicited sanctions, multilateral sanctions or coordinated sanctions between the United States, Europe, and Canada. So far, the CCP seems to have decided that showing off its resolve and punishing anybody that challenges its interests is more important than demonstrating that a Chinese-led world or Chinese-influenced world will in fact live up to the promise of a pluralistic international system in which quote, all things can grow in harmony, as Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in July. So whether it's in China or in the United States, nationalism, I think, is ultimately more likely to repel than it is to attract, whether that's Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy or America first rhetoric. So particularly, I think, in areas where the United States has comparative strengths, education, and innovation and in scientific research, I think it's important that the United States avoid policies that seem to out-China China. And US policymakers should be careful that efforts to punish China, whether in the name of human rights or reciprocity, do not hurt more than help US values and interests. To be sure, there's much for liberal individuals everywhere to criticize in the CCP's behavior, from Xinjiang to Hong Kong or the South China Sea. But even well-intentioned sanctions, I think, may prove self-defeating or undermining if they lead China to double down on its efforts to intimidate dissent globally, or to build a separate sphere of influence that's politically and economically resilient to such sanctions. And so an overly ideological or values-first approach, I think, could backfire, as much as tempting as it is, by prompting the CCP to retaliate in kind, abandoning any effort to reassure others that, as Vice Foreign Minister Liu Yicheng put it, we do not export ideology, nor do we intend to engage in institutional competition. Right now, China is seeking to promote its image and intimidate criticism of the CCP overseas. But Beijing could also, in retaliation, decide to throw its weight behind Russian-style efforts to, sow chaos or disrupt democracy in the United States and elsewhere. So I think we need to be very careful to calibrate the risks of policy overreaction that might imperil the vitality of the United States, as well as practical cooperation, whether that's in fighting the coronavirus or more as pressingly the threat of climate change. I think overall, our best response to what looks to be an increasingly nationalistic authoritarian China is to ultimately adopt what I call an asymmetric approach, which means, yes, revitalizing the international partnerships and institutions that have long supported US leadership, not to contain China, but to shape its calculations. But perhaps most importantly, it means reinvesting and protecting in the openness and dynamism of US society, as well as upholding the democratic values and institutions, starting right here at home. Well, thanks so much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. I had to click through all those video things. Thanks so very much. This is really informative and really quite an interesting discussion on the Chinese sort of how they're driven. These three pillars have been a really fascinating look at this. I'd like to start with some of the questions here. So is there any evidence in your view that what seems to be an accurate assessment of the fundamentals that motivate China exist in leadership, politicians, and military in our country? in the US?
So it is, I do think that there is a widespread recognition in the United States that China is really, a domestic politics first, that they need to, appear at least, strong at home, as well as, delivering wealth and stability to their people in order to stay in power. That said, I don't think that some of the implications that I laid out here, specifically the kind of potentially counterproductive nature of high-profile pressure on issues that are kind of central to these pillars, can be counterproductive. I don't think that point is as widely appreciated. So there is, there's also, I think, of course, it may be understood, but then there are also domestic pressures on the US side too that may take priority. And so that kind of mix, I think, has led to where we are today.
So how do you think China's wolf warrior diplomacy approach to foreign policy square with its objective to achieving acceptance by a wider community of nations? And how does its widening territorial claims in the South China Sea and nations in that region square with making these nations feel safe?
I think that there's a real divide here, and in some ways you see kind of split personality, split objectives, where on the one hand, China wants to intimidate or beat back and respond with toughness and resolve to criticism of the Chinese Communist Party and its behavior at home and abroad. But you also have, a desire to claim kind of the mantle of global leadership. And certainly these two instincts, I think, are working at cross purposes. But, when push comes to shove, ultimately, it has been that, that emphasis on kind of preserving regime's survival and inoculating particularly domestic audiences against, perceived criticism that are valid, that the CCP has really gone into overdrive, trying to push back and counter and provide a different narrative.
So if the US and Western pressure on Beijing continues or increases, do you see China moving more into a bloc mentality, forging new ties with Russia and Iran?
I do see, tactically, the Chinese government, trying to, turn to it doesn't have quite the alliance relationships at all that the United States has and is trying to draw upon. But I think you do see the timing of, the kind of collaboration with Russia reflecting the fact that, the more that China perceives a kind of a united front appearing, a coalition of states confronting China in unison, the more China will both try to drive a wedge between these partners and allies, as well as look to its own friends and partners to shore up those relationships.
Thank you. Could you comment on China's ambitions in Africa? Are they seeking a neo-colonialist position, or are they where they gain hegemony over natural resources, or will this eventually lead to some kind of military intervention?
I see in China's motivations in Africa or many regions around the world as reflecting a combination of strategic motives. I don't think it can be easily captured in the kind of neo-colonialist frame. It isn't colonialism for colonialism's sake, but nonetheless, China does seek access to strategic resources. It does seek geopolitical friends that can help blunt criticism of China at the United Nations, and it seeks a market for its products and its technologies, places for its companies to do business. And so that kind of mix of motives has led China to go outward around the world, and Africa's no exception. That said, I think that there are like longstanding historical relationships where China has, championed its role or sought to present itself as a champion of the developing world, and Africa is one of the areas in which it historically played that role. And so you do have kind of the legacy of that as well. And so a lot of Chinese assistance activities are also directed in that area.
Can you comment on how the U.S. domestic issues are influencing U.S. China policy?
Well, where to start? I think that there's a lot of ways in which domestic issues in the United States have affected U.S.-China relations. First, I think by, China is not immune to, what happened, the turmoil that both preceded and followed the, 2020 election, the events of January 6th, all giving, the Chinese government additional ammunition for pointing out kind of the chaotic and fallible nature of U.S. democracy, and so there, when China proclaims that it has a superior system, it often likes to raise, as it did in Anchorage, the many problems that the United States faces, real problems. These are not all made up. Far from it. And so, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anti-Asian violence, these are, real domestic challenges here in the United States that, authoritarian states around the world like to use to blunt criticism of their own domestic human rights and political issues. I guess another way in which I think, domestic politics in the United States has, affected the relationship is by creating the expectation that the Biden administration will be tough on China or else, and I think that there is, that I think there's it's a little bit more mythical than than frequent uses of the term, bipartisan consensus, but appears to be fact. But I think there's a little bit of myth there. But nonetheless, it is, I think, the perception that it exists, I think, makes it difficult for the Biden administration's nominees, for example, to get through their confirmation processes without appearing to use very tough on China rhetoric, and so that has too created, I think, demands on the U.S. side for this kind of public stance that is very tough on China.
So related to that, the Biden administration is currently out Chining, China, the DOJ China initiative, student stance in recent bilateral talks. Some commentators, such as Ian Johnson, have suggested more specific alternative approaches to the Biden administration may take that would be more productive. What specific policies or rhetoric would you like the U.S. to drop, and what would take their place if we're to seek a more productive form of engagement?
So I think the areas in which the Trump administration was out Chinaing and the Biden administration has yet to unwind are these areas that affect U.S. society, scientific research communities, et cetera. And so the China initiative, I think, is one of those where the perception of too indiscriminately surveilling or investigating researchers that might seem to have ties to China, whether because of their ethnicity or their scientific collaborations, that really puts a pow on the kind of the open science model that has really allowed U.S. higher institutions of higher education and the whole kind of tech innovation ecosystem to rise to the forefront around the world. Another area I think is in the area of exchange and people to people contacts. Obviously, the pandemic has contributed, but nonetheless, the suspension of the Fulbright and Peace Corps programs, I think is one area that it would be wise to see if those could be reinstated. Obviously, like there are many things that have evolved in a relatively, what seemed like a reciprocal manner, so would need to be, unwound with the Chinese side as well. So it's not something that some of these cannot simply be done unilaterally, but nonetheless, I think are ways that have hurt the United States more than helped.
Thank you. One last question. It's been reported that China quietly is making infrastructure investments globally, I believe through their BRI program. Is the goal, do you think, to replace the US in terms of a monetary standard, or trying to replace World Bank with the yen versus dollar, et cetera?
Yeah. So this is a really important way in which it's important to disaggregate the existing set of international sort of norms, practices, and institutions that govern the world, because my understanding, and I'm not an expert in the International Monetary Order, but nonetheless, my understanding is from experts that this is an area in which China really faces a very steep uphill challenge in trying to, reduce dollar dominance around the world. There are a lot of changes that China would have to make in terms of relaxing capital controls, et cetera, that it would need to do to, really increase international uptake of the renminbi. So, China's too often, I think, U.S. statements sweepingly describe China as a challenge to the rules-based order, without recognizing that, in some ways, even if it might desire to, reduce the U.S. position and leadership, they're really not, they don't really have any practical way of doing so.
Thank you. This has been a really delightful talk. At this time, I'd like to introduce the Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs, Meredith McQuaid, and she'll give us a few closing remarks. Meredith?
Well, good afternoon. Sorry, I have to, the questions coming in are fascinating. And Dr. Weiss, I'm so sorry we don't have you for 2 hours, because I guess I just didn't appreciate how starved we are. A thoughtful, cogent, provocative, calm lecture presentation. Just the graphic about the low centrality and high centrality and the contestation makes it so much more just a nice lens to see these so many issues that we have, some just in China, but many, of course, between our two countries. So I can't thank you enough. It's been a great session. I went online and ordered some of your books, and I feel like everybody that was here today should get a couple of credits, because we just had an awesome course. It was truly a wonderful pleasure to have you, and you've given us a great service. Everybody who was able to join, we've noticed, probably you have as well, many of these webinars attract more people from all around the world than we ever could have had if we could have you here live, but we will be inviting you back live. But really, you've just educated a lot of people who already have a strong interest in China and on our two countries trying to work things out. So I'm very, very grateful for your time, expertise, and I hope we get to see you sometime in person, but thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much. It's really been a pleasure.